I'm Harold Monroe, Editor-in-Chief at the Vancouver Sun and Province, and here with Steve Mossop, Executive Vice President at Leger, to explore the path ahead for the new mayors in Vancouver and Surrey. Hi, Steve. That was a pretty remarkable election night.
It was an exciting election night. You don't often see that with municipal elections and see the turnover and the change that we saw last night. So, in all accounts, it was a success from a media perspective, but also voter engagement. It's always interesting when you see things come down to the wire in some cases and see change the way we saw last night.
Yeah, well, the Leger poll that you did for us earlier this month anticipated wins for Ken Sim in Vancouver and Brenda Locke in Surrey. With poll respondents saying they wanted change, significant change in both Surrey and Vancouver, you told us this was a strong indicator that both incumbents were in trouble, and that proved to be the case.
It is a leading indicator. You think of our first poll that we did almost a month ago, and the desire for change in Metro Vancouver was higher than what we've seen in previous years, and it was certainly higher in Surrey and Vancouver. And then, of course, just last week we did the poll, the deep dive in Vancouver and Surrey. We found the same numbers, even higher. So, and that's often a leading indicator of change at a municipal level, or federal, or a provincial for that matter. When you have over 50% of the population saying, I'm voting for change, even if they haven't decided who they're voting for, in the weeks prior, it's usually a pretty good indicator that somebody's in trouble at the mayor's office.
And that was certainly the case here. I mean, everyone was a little concerned or puzzled by what the vote splits might look like because there were so many relatively prominent candidates running in both Surrey and Vancouver with slates. But when you sort of add it all up, if you will, the anti-Stewart vote was certainly there, more than 2-1. Ken Sim got almost all of it. Whereas in Surrey, it was, again, more than 2-1 anti-McCallum. Brenda Locke and Gordie Hogue came dangerously close to splitting the vote. McCallum almost crept back in there.
Yeah, it was reminiscent of 4 years ago, and it was a kind of a relief from a pollster's angle because we did predict that he would lose, and he certainly did, even if it was only 900 votes. But that desire for change is really that top indicator. And we also saw some discontent in other areas. They weren't satisfied with the council, especially in Surrey, on a number of different fronts, especially on the files that voters care about. So we saw early in the campaign that voter sentiments had shifted, and we saw things like homelessness and poverty and the housing crisis really elevated issues in the municipal agenda, even though they're typically not municipal issues. So those were also an indicator that that discontent would result in what we saw last night.
Yeah, so I do want to dig into both cities. The new mayors can maybe take a few cues on how to govern from those Leger poll results. So why don't we start in Vancouver? Ken Sim and his ABC party swept to power with majorities on council, school board, and park board. So on council, which issues should be priorities if he wants to get reelected again in 4 years?
Well, it was interesting when we did our first poll and the second one that showed housing affordability at the top of the list. And every website that you went to with every candidate, pretty much across Metro Vancouver and Vancouver, City of Vancouver is no exception, is that housing was really the number one issue that all candidates were talking about, with, of course, different angles. So housing, they can't escape and get away from. I think Ken Sim's advantage is that he had some tangible options that people believed in to address the issue, and maybe other candidates just gave it face value because voters cared about it.
Okay. And then just crime and street concerns, street level concerns, that was also relatively high in Vancouver.
Yes, it was. If you look at the so we have homelessness, poverty, mental health as a sort of a catch-all, and that was the second most important issue. But when we broke it down and asked further, it breaks down into a number of categories. Random stranger attacks was mentioned by 17%, cleaning up tent cities, 15%, opioid crisis, 14%. So you add those together on top of homelessness, poverty, really collectively it outweighed housing affordability as the number one issue in the city of Vancouver.
And then on park board, we asked about bike lanes, which can't recall how they fared there, but that's not a policy for ABC, I don't believe. They in Stanley Park, they do want to freeze park board fees and spend more on parks and fields. I don't know. That didn't really show.
It was a contentious issue. We asked people outright, do they believe that the parks board should be abolished? aside from voting for the different members, and it was more people thought it should be abolished than should be kept the way it is. And then the issues within that, expansion of bike lanes. Bike lanes have always been a controversial issue in Vancouver, even from, when we first polled a dozen years ago on it. And no exception now, only 37% support bike lanes in Stanley Park expanding and 36% oppose. So it's a difficult issue for any candidate to address.
Were there any school board questions in the poll?
We didn't do school board specifically, no.
Okay. We did ask about policing more generally with council, and this new school board is promising to bring back liaison officers to schools, police liaison officers. So that will, might play into that theme around policing.
I think so. Now, that's the number 4 issue on the list of issues that voters are concerned about in Vancouver.
Okay. And then over in Surrey, new Mayor Brenda Locke and her Surrey Connect party have a slimmer majority, a 5-4 majority this time. So where does Locke start based on the Leger poll?
Well, she's got the tough, we've got the public support behind her. We asked about the Surrey police issue, and that's been front and center really for 4 years. It's polled on very infrequently, but our latest poll showed that people are still opposed to that decision. And in fact, 51% had believed that it's best to reverse the decision, go back to RCMP. Now, whether she saw our poll or not, but she knows the public sentiment around that. And it's now a challenging issue. Her detractors say it's not doable. She says it's an easy fix. There's concern among the general public as to how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take. But she seemed to be very confident that this would be a fairly straightforward process that would get the endorsement of the Attorney General and whoever else in the provincial government that needed to support that decision.
And of course, she can't be wholly obsessed with that. She can't take her eye off of housing affordability, which is another big issue in Surrey.
Exactly. Not unlike the city of Vancouver, Surrey polled very similarly on the top issues: housing affordability, homelessness, poverty, and then you get into more traditional areas. In the city of Surrey, property taxes and spending was higher than in other municipalities, so the candidates had some things to say about that. And they also suffer from, unique traffic congestion issues that maybe don't exist in other parts of Metro Vancouver. There's also controversy and mismanagement around municipal funds. That's an issue that doesn't appear in the rest of Metro Van. It was an issue in the city of Surrey. And they also are dealing with opioid drug poisonings and trash and litter and things like that city of Vancouver also faced.
You mentioned taxes, that people are certainly sensitive to that, particularly in these days of high inflation. So when you get new councils with their own agendas, like in the case of Ken Sim, he wants to hire 100 new police officers and 100 new nurses to deal with the homelessness street issues. Brenda Locke wants to reverse course on the police. We don't know what that's going to cost. So they're going to have to balance their hopes and dreams with that sensitivity around taxes, I would think.
It's really almost an impossible situation, and I'm not sure how they both propose that they're going to do it without tax increases. And the governing, not the governing, but the unions that are all negotiating for their share of the pie for inflationary increases are also putting pressure on those municipalities, and they all have different timeframes for when their contracts are up. But how do you promise all those things and then you negotiate collective bargaining a 5 or 6% raise increase without raising property taxes significantly is really a question that they're going to have to grapple with.
In Vancouver, in the dying days, we saw endorsements for Kennedy Stewart from Adrian Dix and David Eby and many other New Democrats. And he obviously didn't perform very well in the polls. Can you take anything from municipal election results and translate them to the provincial scene? In other words, should this be worrying for the NDP provincially?
It was interesting. I thought this time around that there was way more of that in a municipal election about endorsements and crossover with the provincial, almost celebrity politicians, if you will. more than we've ever seen. And it raises some interesting questions. If you don't get the mayor that you want, does that mean that the relationship with the provincial government is somehow more difficult or tainted? So I think the voters do question that, and they put them in different camps. And when we see that crossover, I think it creates some voter confusion, and also a sense of, well, what happens if the mayor doesn't get along with our provincial counterparts? Does that pose a problem for governance in the city? And that's yet to be determined.
We've seen historically that whether you have a mayor who skews left or right, and regardless of who's in Victoria, they do have to work together because it is the largest city, and certainly the NDP would have a lot of votes in Vancouver provincial ridings in the next election, so they're going to want to keep Vancouver voters happy, I guess, regardless of who's in office.
Yeah, and the response that I've heard politicians say is that, well, we have to get along. So whether, I endorse a particular candidate or not, there's still lots of work that has to be done intergovernmentally on a lot of files. Homelessness, poverty is probably the biggest one. There has to be collaboration and cooperation.
Great. All right, Steve, thanks for your insights again today and through the campaign. And let's do it all again in 4 years.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Harold.